This is the multiple award-winning GardenDC Podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine. Our content is aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 225 of the GardenDC Podcast. In this episode, we talk with ecologist Michael Gage about his work in historical ecology. The plant profile is on foxglove, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events in the What's New segment. We close out with a last word on starting seeds in egg cartons from Christy Page of Green Prints. This episode, we're joined by Michael Gage. He is an ecologist, and he will be talking to us all about knowing your land and defining what that might mean. Welcome, Michael.
Greetings. Good to be with you.
Great to have you. And before we get into all of that and how we can decipher or read our land, so to speak, we like to ask our guests here on the GardenDC podcast, were they born with a green thumb and chlorophyll in their veins?
Yeah, I don't think I was born with a green thumb. I might have been born with green feet, meaning that as a kid, I grew up upstate New York in the kind of Albany suburbs, a bit north there of Saratoga County. And as a even from a pretty early age, I, along with my friends, I was out and about a lot, and we grew up. I grew up in a very large housing development, the largest housing development north of New York City. It's very large, and it's actually the most egalitarian census district in the country. So, for better or worse, everybody there is kind of the same. But what we had was that we had a lot of woods. There were woods sort of in the center of the development, about 100 acres, and little patches here and there, kind of everywhere. And so I grew up roaming around a lot, and this is the 1980s when I was a kid, and so that, that's the green feet I was born with, if you will. That was just wanting to be out in the forest all the time, and so we were building forts, we're building trails, we're building whatever. And that's how I got started as a kid.
And how did you translate that love of exploration and tramping around in the woods as a kid to your career?
Yeah, as I got older, my sort of geographic range continued to expand. So, as a kid, it was kind of as far away as my bicycle would take me. And then once I was mobile and had a car, I was going a little farther and farther to the Adirondacks and elsewhere. And I didn't know, at the end of high school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I took some classes here and there at the State University, but really couldn't figure it out because as a kid, there seemed to be some expectation that your career had to end in the letters ER, right? You were either a teacher or a lawyer or a banker or something, and there was nothing that ended in ER that really appealed to me, and so I just kept kind of doing my thing. Eventually, I ended up at a college in Arizona called Prescott College, which had the most robust field studies program of any college in the country, and so I did multiple semesters that were entirely taught in the field. So we were camping out all the time, but we were, taking notes and taking tests and reading and giving presentations all in the field, all being transported in a van or backpacking or paddling. And so I was really fortunate to find that place because it meant that I could learn nature in nature and not be in a classroom. And for me, that was the way to do it. And that was the only way that I was ever going to be successful in doing it because that's my place. And so after Prescott College, I went to graduate school at a place called Antioch University in New Hampshire. And I studied with a guy named Tom Wessels. And Tom Wessels, maybe you've heard his book, Reading the Forested Landscape, which is kind of a kind of an eco classic, and it's specific to New England, but it really applies everywhere. The concepts are the same everywhere, and so this book, what Tom Wessels does is he approaches ecology from a lens of history. And some of that history is human, so like old agriculture, abandoned agricultural fields, old pastures, etc. Or some of that history is natural, right? Like beavers that they build ponds, and then eventually those dams they fail, and the beaver pond drains out, and the forest comes back. And so everything is sort of understood through this disturbance history or through a chronology. And I had never considered that. All my time running around in the woods as a little kid, I was sort of blissfully unaware that the world had history, right? And I was just in this ever-present state of like, these are the trees, and they're here now, and they've only been around since I've been around, and I'm 10 years old, and that's the age of the forest. And obviously that was, I couldn't have been more wrong. And so I learned all this stuff under Wessels, and then kind of I think the final piece that sort of put me on this track, and this is not what I intended to do. I went to graduate school to study large carnivores and bears and mountain lions and things. But what I learned was this sort of stuff, these field marks for seeing the land through this historical lens, they're everywhere. And the world is so interesting when, for me at least, when I see the world through this lens, it's like, it's at times it's inescapable. And so I'm walking down a city street, and I might see little pieces of the landscape before it was so urbanized. And it makes for a very rich and rewarding experience. So I ended up with a little internship when I was a graduate student in Louisville, Kentucky. It was a park project, and they were in the stage of acquiring land and doing a master plan. And my job was to wander around this 4,000 acres and take this Wessels approach and try to understand every acre of this 4,000 acres of how it came to be the way it was. Was it old agricultural land that was abandoned? Has it always been forested? Was there old growth? What's going on this site? And that information gave the landscape architects a lot of really detailed information on how to plan the park, where the trails should be, where they should stay away from. That project is called the Parklands of Floyd's Fork, and now it's open. It's a big 4,000 acre urban park system, and it's a really, really amazing place. And so then, people, the landscape architects and others, they kind of knew I had this interest in this ability, and so I kept getting these callbacks of like, hey, we've got this other property, come help us do this. And that's kind of how it happened. I didn't seek out this sort of gig, but it kept following me around.
It almost sounds like you were born to it, so to speak.
That's the green feet that I came out with.
Excellent. Well, so that is all fascinating, but before we dive into how you do your job and maybe some of the stories from the places you've explored, I want to ask you about your own home landscape. Do you garden? And if so, what is the climate like, and where are you located, and what do you grow?
My home landscape is around Saratoga Springs, upstate New York, north of Albany. And everything here in this part of the world needs to be understood through its glacial history. So 13,000 years ago, the glaciers melted back. It didn't quite get down to the mid-Atlantic, and sort of northern New Jersey, northern Pennsylvania was about the southern extent. And here I sit on 4 feet of clay. And if I go about a mile to the west of here, there's probably 100 or more feet of sand. The sand was deposited at the shoreline of that big old glacial lake that I live at the bottom of. And then as you get deeper into that lake, which is where I am, it's all clay. So I live along the shoreline. There's still an existing lake here, and I live on the shores of that. It is very flat. It is very swampy. It is very clayey. But I'm still looking out the window to my maybe 40 by 40 foot garden, and it's winter, so it's asleep. And we, even with raised beds, it's still, nobody likes to grow in our garden because you just get down past the raised bed and it's it's wet. It's wet all the time. Even in a drought, it's still wet. So in those beds, we have 4 beds. One is for tree seedlings, one is for flowers, and we do 2 for vegetables. And we get a pretty good crop of a few things in the vegetables. Cucumbers and tend to do well. The tomatoes never really do well. And then in the flowers, I wish I could tell you what is in there. We inherited we didn't inherit my aunt. She was ripping out her beds, and we salvaged as much as we could, and we just stuck them in our bed for the short term until we figure out a better place to put them. But I do have big plans for what I would love to do in this property for a garden, but it's so I would need to choose all sort of wet-sided kind of things.
Interesting. Or containers.
Yeah, right. And we do have a lot of containers. We keep them by the doorstep and everything else, and it's beautiful. We have the property was settled in 1930s or 40s, and so there's still a lot of that era of stuff hanging around here. So I've got these big trumpet creeper vines going up in a cottonwood. I've got lots of the orange, we always called them tiger lilies. I think they're just regular orange daylilies. Lots of hosta, all this sort of mid-century, these mid-century plants that just they will be here for 1,000 years, I suspect.
Yeah, I would say in the vernacular.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. All right, so let's turn to your work. And I love the phrase, know your land. And I think you also call it historic ecology is the more proper term. Can you define that for our listeners?
Yeah, sort of like what I was mentioning about the kind of Wessel's approach to ecology of seeing it through a lens of history. That's kind of my thing. And so, but as I mentioned with my own home landscape of understanding it, with the glacier history and all that, you really have to approach a piece. If you really want to understand a piece of property or know it well, you have to take it through these 3 layers. The first layer is the physical layer. That's geology, that's water, that's all that stuff that's not alive, that's below your feet. The second layer is the vegetation, which is just a reflection of the physical layer, right? So different rock types have different chemistry, different, clay is different from sand, and the vegetation, the natural vegetation, is going to respond to all those things. And then lastly is the human layer. And the human layer is, for the last, I would say a few hundred years, but it's really several thousand years, that human layer has been modifying and manipulating the landscape at all scales for a very long time. And so I look for aspects of all these different things and try to stitch it up in a way that's like, this is a result of this. The agricultural history here of the farmlands that were abandoned, say 100 years ago, is leading to the forest looking like this, and try to reconstruct how the land has changed over time.
And so with that information, do you create a report for your client, and then what are they going to do with this information?
Yeah, so it depends on who the property owner is. And so I do work for organizations and private landowners. And so for organizations, and that spans the gamut, right, from a property that is undergoing a master plan to be a park, for example, right? And my information will provide for them really detailed ground inventory, which from there they can build their circulation plan where they're going to put trails or roads or whatever, as well as a foundation for any education or interpretation. So, here's a property and it has like these really nice cliffs. Well, here's the rock type of those cliffs, etc. In my area, the glacial history, understanding that is always of interest for people. If you're out for a hike and you sort of crossing boundaries between different glacial layers, that can be made into whether it's a sign at the trailhead or a digital interpretive trail or whatever the case may be. So that's kind of in that domain. At the other end of the spectrum is more of like a private landowner, and for those people, these are people who they love their land. They know what they know. They may not know the depth and breadth that I can help them with, but they love the land and they want to know as much as they can about it. And so I'll go in, do the field inventory. Sometimes I do archival research. Say I will trace the land ownership history, perhaps get old agricultural census records, and to try to reconstruct like what was going on your property throughout the 1800s into the first half of the 1900s. Who was here? What were they doing? When were they doing it? Those kind of questions. And then I write it up. Sometimes it's just a sort of a prosaic report with lots of maps and photos and tables and everything. Sometimes, for some people who are interested, I recruit a very good friend named Autumn von Plinsky. She'll do some watercolor paintings of the property. We make it a hardbound kind of book. It might be 100 or 200 pages about the property. And they just, it's a coffee table thing, and they love the land, they love to share it, and that's what it ends up being. My hope is when I do private landowner work that most people are interested in kind of the management aspect of their property, right? Mm-hmm. And whether they've owned the property for 50 years or for 5 years, what can you do to make this property better? Whether that's cleaning out invasive species, and I map those out. Here are the trouble areas, here are the nice areas. And then get a prioritized list of like, if you want to go after 5 places, these are the 5 places you should go after. Whether you do it yourself or you hire a contractor, these are areas that would do well with improvement. Or watchable wildlife, like if you have lots of nice grasslands, let's find some places to put up some kestrel boxes or screech owl boxes and get some more critters. It's interesting in Northern Virginia, where I do a lot of work in the Piedmont area. A lot of people in the area around Fauquier County, where I spend time, they've been putting up kestrel boxes in the last few years. And one property, they put up 19 boxes, and within 2 years, all of those boxes were inhabited. And wow. It's amazing. And they put cameras in some of them so you can watch the chicks as they're born and all. It's really, really cool. And what it speaks to, though, is it speaks to the the importance of and the lack of large old trees out on the landscape, because these are cavity nesting birds. And so there's plenty of food, there's plenty of space. They just don't have a tree to dwell in. And so people put up boxes, and it, helps alleviate that problem to some degree.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't thought about it as a place for where you could plan wildlife habitat or expansion, or really knowing what wildlife is on the property currently. So you were saying that one of your ambitions had been to study large carnivores. And so I was going to ask you if you had encountered any large carnivores in your jobs.
Yeah, not as many as I would wish. The more the better from my perspective. Yeah, Northern Virginia, it's amazing. I go down there, again, I'm from upstate New York, and usually for a few weeks every spring and the fall, and I work on different properties or I lead programs. And just I always see foxes, and they're so fun to watch. Right? They're so intelligent, and you watch them kind of working their way through a field. And I saw that I was sitting on a stone wall one day, just a few miles south of Middleburg on a property, and just taking a break, doing nothing, very quiet. And this fox comes by, and she's, I don't know, she's 20 feet away from me, and her whole mouth is just full of voles. And she looks over at me, and she realizes she thought she was in a bad situation. I know that she's in a fine situation because I'm not going to do anything to this fox. But she dropped them all. And I went over there after, and she had 11 voles in her little jaw all at one time. And so I got out of there. Hopefully I'm sure she went back and got them all. And then let's see what else. Up on the Blue Ridge area, another private property, I didn't run in. Now, again, I was sitting quietly doing nothing, taking a little break out in the field. It's a 500-acre private property. And this, I don't know, probably a 2-year-old bear kind of strolled through, and I just stayed very quiet. And it was, I don't know, maybe 50 or 100 feet away. And it's just wonderful to have these encounters,
Yeah, super special. So one of the Northern Virginia properties that I saw that you were working with was the Oak Spring Garden Foundation. and that was the Bunny Mellon estate. And I visited there a few times, but I had no idea that they had this report done. So it was really fascinating to see that on your website.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Yeah, that one is once I have a few on the website that people have, let me post. Most people, I don't even ask. There's no sense posting everyone's private property on my site, but Oak Spring, it's such an amazing place. And this is the home of Rachel Lambert Mellon, aka Bunny Mellon, and her husband Paul. Paul died in I think 1999, and Bunny in 2014 or so. And this was their primary residence. The property at their time was about 4,000 acres. It was Mr. Mellon started acquiring that beginning in 1931, and just stitching together farm after farm until they hit that point of about 4,000 acres. And then the two, they were both a second marriage for both of them later in life, and 1940s, and that was their primary residence. They had other residencies all over the place, as many people know, but that was home. And again, my job there was right when the foundation, about a year after the foundation was established, was to do the inventory. And we laugh now. Sir Peter Crane, who's the president of Oak Spring, and he's been there since 2016, which is when he invited me there. And when he called me, we laughed because he said, well, it's 260 acres of mostly grass. I don't think there'll be all that much to find. And I suppose I took that as a bit of a challenge, because we ended up with almost 200 pages of information, but that's archival. I traced back ownership history all the way back to Lord Fairfax, who had this massive 5 million acre land grant. There's, the geology is just on and on and on about the property. But, and then Oak Spring reacquired another portion of the Mellon estate later, and I also worked on that property. And so what's amazing is that within these two properties, which total about 700 acres, I found 45 native tree species. But I should mention that the total woodland area on that 700 acres is only about 50 acres. And then there's scattered trees here and there. So that's higher tree diversity on that little property. I mean, it's 700 acres, but just those little woodlands, right? 150 acres of woodlands. That's greater tree diversity than Yosemite and Yellowstone National Parks combined. And one of the things we don't often appreciate here in the East is the level of plant diversity that we have in these forests. Mm-hmm. It's really, really remarkable, and it far surpasses just about anything in the West. The West has its grandeur in other ways, right? The biggest, oldest, tallest trees in the world, the mountains, the deserts, on and on and on. I could praise the West for hours, but the East has it in its diversity, and it's really, really remarkable.
Yeah, so fascinating. And I was looking at some of the history on the property. There's a cemetery on site, a historic one that takes up almost a half acre.
Right.
And I was surprised to see that because, as you say, when you visit, it just looks like rolling hills of pasture. And you're like, it's beautiful, but there's not much else there.
Yeah, that's right. And you look at it and you're like, wow, well, it couldn't be that much going on here. And as you get into it, it just starts to unfold in so many ways. And then when you dig up, say, for example, I spent a lot of time with old aerial photographs, and that part of Virginia has some of the oldest. 1937 was the first set in that region. And when you look at those and you look at the modern landscape, and then when you dig up some of the old deeds that have plats in them, the old survey maps, and at least that part of Virginia, Fauquier, Loudoun, and the surrounding counties, the pattern of forest and field that's there today hasn't changed a whole lot since the Civil War. And so by that time, everything that was going to be cleared was cleared. It was probably around the low point of woodland cover, was probably around the Civil War, within a decade or two before or after. And it's only been in the 1900s that those very marginal farmlands, like too wet, too steep, too rocky, that those places have been abandoned and reforested. But I would say that moved that part of Virginia probably from a forest cover of what was probably about 10 or 15% to probably 15 or 20%. It's still a very open landscape, 80% or more open.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with Ground Cover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional turfgrass lawn. In the last few years alone, over 23 million Americans converted part of the lawn to a natural landscape, and now they're looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn? Knowing how and when to replace your turf and which plants are the best ones for the job. Ground Cover Revolution is here with all the answers you need, and some you didn't even know you needed. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the specifics on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Ground Cover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Ground Cover Revolution is available now wherever you buy books, including Amazon.com and bookshop.org.
Girl, you have got to try this Laneige lip mask. Trust me, my lips needed that love. Love these vanilla vibes from Kayali. That top note is just so smooth. Smooth and stunning. That's what you get with this K18 hair mask.
Those brands everybody's talking about, they're at Sephora. Discover the hype with the hottest names in beauty, including Laneige, Kayali, K18, and Rare Beauty. Only at Sephora.
Any fun facts you can share with us from that Oak Spring report?
Fun facts from Oak Spring. Well, it's interesting. So there's two properties there that Oak Spring still owns, two farms. One is the one where the Mellon residence is, and that we call that Little Oak Spring. And then across the road is the Rokeby property, which had kind of the farm operations during the Mellon times. And the Little Oak Spring property was settled by farmers, the Fletcher family, there was their name, settled in the 20s. And it stayed with that family for a bit over 100 years. And then there was one intermediary before Paul Mellon. And so it's, everything was, sort of very humble and down to earth, and just, it was a farmer's property. The other side of the property, of the road, the Rokeby property, was settled by a guy named Edward Carter. He had 5,000 acres that he inherited from, I don't remember if it's his father or grandfather or great-grandfather, but the Carter family was a big property-owning family at that time. And Edward Carter, came from a very wealthy family, and he carved out his 700 acres or 600 acres of what is now the Rokeby property. That was presumably the best land in that 5,000 acres because he settled that for himself and he started selling off the rest. As the property moves along into other people, it was next owned by Nathan Loughborough. Nathan Loughborough was the assistant secretary of the Treasury. He was kind of the right-hand man for Alexander Hamilton. What is now American University was Nathan Loughborough's original estate. It was called Grasslands, and it was about 200 and some acres, and that is the campus of American University. Rokeby out in the, I don't know why this guy needed another 600 acres, 50 miles away, but that's what he decided he needed to do. And then his son farmed it. And so there's a really fascinating pedigree of people who owned that Rokeby side. It went on to be, it was owned by the physician of President Wilson. It was owned by the Oxnard brothers, who settled Oxnard, California. They were a big sugar family, and they owned it for a while. So there's this interesting kind of pedigree of those people. on that side, but the other side, it was just, this family farmer that no one has ever heard of.
So fascinating. And yeah, many luminaries in that area over the centuries too.
Indeed.
And how about the evidence of maybe some of the enslaved peoples that were on these properties, or even going back to the indigenous peoples before that?
Yeah. So starting with the kind of going a little farther back in time, the indigenous people, it's fascinating. There was a gardener there at Oak Spring named Boyd Pauley, and he passed a few years ago, but he had worked for the Mellons for, 40, 50 years or something. And he had amassed this incredible collection of what we might call arrowheads. A better term would be lithics or projectile points. And he had like 75 of these things. And so Oak Spring, we photographed them all sort of very carefully. And I sent them all to I just found a name in the yellow pages, essentially, off the web. And Dr. Carol Nash, and she is amazing. She's looking at photographs, and she interpreted each one of these things to the stone type, where the stone came from, what the tool was, the cultural period of the tool, which is the time period. It's unbelievable the amount of information that she can extract out of these things. But in the end, there were points from 11,000 years ago up until historic times, about 500 years ago. And some of the stones, most of them were local. They were local quartz, but some of them came from as far away as Harper's Ferry. And I can't remember, about 50 to 100 miles away. So pretty impressive in that regard. Along those lines, there's one tree at Oak Spring, and it got crushed in a storm a couple of years ago, this big wind event that happened in June of 22, I think it was. But this tree is, it's a big, wide-spreading old white oak. And when I looked at it, I thought this tree has been open grown. Like, one of the things I look for when I'm trying to understand landscape history is I look at the species of trees and I look at the shapes of trees. And this one, by its shape, suggested to me that it had always been open grown. And so I cored the tree with an imprint borer, right, to count the rings. And the tree itself was 265 years old. This was almost 10 years ago now. 265 years old. And then I went up in a lift and I cored some of the limbs, and the limbs were 240 years old. So this was confirming the fact that this tree has always been open grown. And so that raises a really interesting question, because if you don't mow the grass in our part of the world, then you get a forest eventually. And so what was maintaining this landscape as open in the mid 1700s and earlier? And so what I think this tree is telling us and showing us is it is clear evidence of land use management by indigenous people prior to settlement in that region, because there were no Europeans in that space anywhere around that neighborhood until the 1790s. And so this tree was already 50 years old at that point. And so I think we're seeing the legacy of burning by Native people, which was widespread in the Virginia Piedmont, right up until historic times. So that was super cool. I've only found a couple trees in all my wanderings that really show clear evidence of indigenous land management and manipulation, and that one was really cool. And it's really, really sad that it's dead, but it's still standing. It's just not alive anymore.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. The other side of that coin to your question, in the slightly more recent times, is the slave history. So at Little Oak Spring, the Robert Fletcher's will, which was 1841, he had 7 enslaved people listed, and I can't remember the gender or age breakdown, but it was mixed. I remember one of them, the name was Mountain Billy, one of them was Caroline, but it has the names in that will. And I didn't find a later census or anything for him. On the other side of the road, as I mentioned, this was the more, the wealthier farm. Under Nathan Loughborough, the 1860 slave census over there lists 24 enslaved people on that property. And if I remember correctly, I think there were 5. On the slave census form, they list the number of houses. I think there were 5 houses listed. And on that one, I forget that exact number. It was fairly evenly split in gender breakdown, but it was like half, children under the age of 10 or something like this. and but no names on those forms, and I couldn't find a will or anything else to track down those names. There is a big effort in Fauquier County. I think it's called the Fauquier County African American Association, and they're trying to get all the names of all the enslaved people from that period, and they're having a lot of success.
Well, I wish them luck on that. I know it's quite a mystery to unravel a lot of those, since written records weren't always kept, or at least still exist,
right,
for us to search out. So I wanted to ask you about some of the cool things that you've seen in the woods. And one of the things you had mentioned previously is finding an ancient forest in Baltimore. And is that in Baltimore City itself? And is that on public property or private?
Yeah, it is. It's on public. Well, yeah, it's Silburn Arboretum, which is right in Baltimore. It's, I guess, a little north, a little upstream of downtown. Silburn was, I don't know, it's about 150 acres or something. And it's kind of on this little hilltop, and it was settled. I can't remember the earliest settler that I found reference to. Hook maybe was the name, but it was the early 1800s. But then there's a mansion there, and they call it the mansion. And it was Tyson was the last name, and he was kind of made a lot of money mining in the hills up around Baltimore. But the forest that you mentioned, it's really fascinating. So Silburn is surrounded. There's kind of the hilltop, the mansion, and the gardens. Really beautiful place. And then the perimeter, as it slopes down, it trails off and it heads down to the stream down in the kind of a deep ravine where the interstate is, and it's all forest covered. And it's about 120 acres of forest, and they've got trails throughout this thing. You can go there and walk. It's really, really nice. Some of those forest areas are very, very young, like 1980s and earlier. Some of them are a little bit older, like early 1900s, when they were abandoned farmland. And some of them, I can't remember the exact percentage, I want to say it's probably 50 acres or 40, is original forest, meaning that it was never cleared for agriculture. And within that, there are pockets of old growth. When I saw these trees, I would call old growth forest. So these are white oaks that I confirmed to being 240 years or older. And what's interesting, one of the things, the first, as you go out for a walk with Tom Wessels in the woods, this is where I learned this, the very first thing you look at is to look at the ground. And the ground, what you're looking for is the kind of microtopography of the ground. And in an old growth forest, the ground is pitted and mounded. And that's from centuries or millennia of trees. As they get ripped over by the wind and the roots come out of the ground, they make a pit. And then as the tree decomposes, it leaves all that sediment behind, and there's a mound. And so you go into an old growth forest, and it's very lumpy. This property didn't have any of that. The ground was all smooth. And so it presents sort of this like a paradox almost of like, how do you get old growth forest on smooth ground? And what I suspect is happening, and it would take a lot more tree coring to puzzle this out, but what I suspect is happening is that this was an old Native American field. It's on a slope, and so it was being burned, it was maintained. There's a whole circle of hills. It was called I can't remember if it's the Great Maryland Barrens or the Great Baltimore Barrens, but it sort of circles Baltimore as these kind of low hills that were not forested way back in the day. And this is just kind of on the inside of the margins of that. And so I wonder if this was all area that was open ground at the time of European settlement. And with the abandonment of these Native American land management practices, the forest started coming back. And what I see now as an old growth forest is actually just an old field that has 250-year-old trees in it. So it's one of the more fascinating things that I found, because usually old growth is old growth, right? And that's been forest for a very long time. And we have to kind of twist our mental clocks a little bit, because for a tree, 200 years is not a long time. But for us, when we think about history and everything else, like, wow, yeah, that's a long time. We have to get ourselves on tree time. And even, there has to be a first cohort of trees on any property at some time. And I think that is the first cohort of trees. And they are all now what we'd call old.
Wow. So, yeah, I do recall visiting Silburn at one point in the house. They said that you could see all the way to the port of Baltimore, that he had cleared that owner at that time, so he could see his shipments coming in. Of course, now that view is completely obstructed.
Yeah. Yeah.
You would not be able to see from that far, but I can't even imagine it. But it is a very steep hill. I know in the wintertime, people will use the trails with for snowshoeing, if there's actual coverage of ice and stuff on the ground. But yeah, you get quite a workout walking around Silburn.
It is. It just drops off from the grounds around the house and the mansion. It just drops right off down there. And indeed, there is a cut through there. I think there's a trail there called the Vista Trail, and it goes right down this corridor that even as late as when you look at the old aerial photographs, and I should say Baltimore and Maryland more broadly, is they just have really great online resources for old aerial photos, LiDAR maps, which is maps made with lasers. Maryland is amazing. And you can get these late 1920s, early 1930s aerial photos, and that vista, that cut, I mean, it sticks right out where, looking south from the mansion, looking right down toward the city and the port.
Yeah, so if you are a listener and you have not visited Silburn, I urge you to do so.
Yeah, for sure. Check it out.
Definitely. Especially if you are in the Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia area. It's very easy to access and pretty much free to go anytime. So another one of your cool finds that I was looking at is there's listed a Turkish hazelnut in Virginia.
Yeah, this is so I don't have a lot of claims to fame, but I'll take 3. I found the largest redbud in the state of Kentucky, which has since been overthrown. I found the oldest red oak in existence, which was in Shenandoah National Park. And then this Turkish hazelnut, which is not a native species, right? This is the largest member of the hazelnut family. And this is in Fauquier County. And I forget how big this tree is. It's probably about 2 feet in diameter and 60 feet tall, which is ridiculous for a hazelnut, right? Which barely qualifies as a tree. But it's the largest, and it has to go through that nomination process to get on the official champion trees list.
Mm-hmm. And were there nuts on there? Any edible harvests from that?
That's a good question. I've never seen them. At least they don't fall on the ground, and maybe they're up there in the canopy, and maybe I've never been there the right time of year to see. And I don't know if you get a filbert, a nice hazelnut, I think the ones you'd buy in the store, I think those are English hazelnuts. I'm not really sure about the edibility of those Turkish ones, but I imagine I would guess that they're pretty big, just because it's such a much bigger plant than either the American hazelnuts we have, which are basically shrubs, or the English one.
Well, I was just thinking maybe the squirrels got them all before they hit the ground. Even
likely scenario for sure.
So, if a landowner or homeowner wanted to contract you, what are your fee ranges, and do you have a minimum size of the properties that you look at?
I don't. The smallest property that I've ever written up was 2 acres. The largest one is about 4,500 acres. So, even like my property here, it's about a half acre, and there's still a lot of information to glean out of that, even at a half an acre. So there really isn't a property that's too small. Usually, the variabilities in what a project takes. One, it's the property size, right? And if it's just extensive forest land, I usually cover about 100 acres a day. But if it's a property that's only, say, 20 or 30 acres, I usually just spend the whole day on that and get a very, very detailed look. And then the other variability is like, how deep do you want to go? Are we going to look for archives and dig up the ownership history, or are we just going to do a field inventory? And then, what's the quality of the final project? Some people, some people just go wander around with them for half a day or something, and we just go wander around together and talk about things and take pictures. And then, the extent of my write-up is usually sort of a lengthy email. But then others are like at Oak Spring, we had Autumn painted a bunch of watercolors. They're hardbound, really beautiful paper. And so that's the other end of the extreme. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of variability in what it is, but the important part is, what do you want to know about the property? And, is it like, I just acquired this and I want to do the best stuff for it? Then, let's look at what you have, how it got to be the way it is today, and then think about the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know a lot of people might want to have a list of if the plants on their property are rare, threatened, or endangered, or maybe they're just looking for a tree inventory. And in that case, it's not so much the history they're looking at. Maybe they would engage like a local botanist instead, or arborist.
Yeah, if it's tree related, like, is this tree okay, and do I need to do any work on it? That's an arborist question. That's not me. If it's like, I have these really old trees on my property, can you help me figure out how old they are, or is there a deeper history? That's more in my jam. And the same with the plants. Like, I'm not a specialist botanist. I'm okay. I'm pretty good. I'm good with woody plants. I'm pretty good with most forest herbs, but rare, threatened, endangered, I work in too many states to keep track of that stuff. So that's a great thing for a more local regional botanist who can, give you a really deep dive on what's on the property.
So at cocktail parties, when you tell people what you do, are they like, okay? But I love one of the quotes on your website. It says, all properties bear the imprint of an infinite number of human decisions. Landowners are authors, writing a tome in trees, grasses, rocks, and paths. And I think that's so true that all of us gardeners, every decision you make, every plant you add or remove or move, creates a different story.
Yeah, it's so true. And I'm very fortunate I get to spend a lot of time in Bunny Mellon's garden, and I know just enough about it to kind of get in trouble in my own head, and thinking about, when she established it and some of the changes that have taken place. And it is, she wrote that book, right, of that garden, just like every gardener is writing their own book. And it's a palimpsest too, right? It's getting reworked over and over and over. Whatever space that you have that your garden is in, that hasn't been a garden forever. It might have been a cow pasture. It might have been a crop field. Who knows who was putting their hands in that dirt over the past 200 years or more. And so, they're never finished, right? And they don't really have a clearly defined starting point, and there's no end point either. The land just keeps moving and changing.
So how can our listeners contact you to find out more?
Yeah, best probably go to the website, which is knowyourland.com. That's KNOW, knowyourland.com. And you can, there's a way to get in touch through that. And if anyone really wanted to take a dive and learn more, we've talked a lot about Oak Spring on this show. And every year I teach it's a residential program at Oak Spring. People stay on the property for 4 days, and we are outside in the Virginia Piedmont every day, kind of going through all of these field marks, right, of how you identify old fields, how you identify old trees, areas that have been timbered or logged or pastured, and we just keep going through lots of different sites for the week. So that this year that's happening, I think, the first or second week of May, and if you go to Oak Spring's website, you can find the application and all that stuff.
Excellent. Anything else you'd like our listeners to know, or anything on historical ecology that we haven't covered yet?
I think the only thing I would leave folks with is just to pay attention to the trees, learn the trees. A lot of my work is just all through the trees, right? Some species are what we call early successional. They like full sun. It's just like your garden plants, right? And if you're a person that likes to get outside and take hikes and whatever, if you learn those trees and you go take a walk in Rock Creek Park or wherever, the landscape, it comes alive in ways that you just didn't notice before, right? Where you're seeing, if you see lots of tulip poplar and they're all the same age, that was an old field or an old clear cut. If you're seeing lots of different species with, big white oaks, then that's probably been forested all the time. And it doesn't take a lot of instruction or effort to sort of pick up on these clues, but to me, it really makes your experience a lot more rewarding.
So get out there and start exploring. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thanks, Kathy. Really enjoyed it.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
In the book The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Terry Spate, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the genius ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space. No matter what you grow, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the urban garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
Sergeant and Mr. Smith, you're going to love this house.
Bunk beds in a closet?
There's no field manual for finding the right home. But when you do, USAA Homeowners Insurance can help protect it the right way. Restrictions apply.
Foxglove plant profile. Foxglove digitalis purpurea is a biennial or short-lived herbaceous perennial. The flowers resemble long tubular bells running along a tall stem, and they are commonly found in shades of pink and purple. The foliage is a clump of coarse leaves covered in fine hairs. It is native to Western Europe and is hardy to zones 4 to 9. Foxgloves prefers full sun to light shade and soil with lots of organic matter and good drainage, although they can grow in most soil conditions. During the first year of growth, the leaves form, and then in the second year, the tall flower stalks emerge in late spring or early summer. Flowers are visited by many pollinators, including hummingbirds. The flower spikes make good cut flowers. Exercise caution, though, as all parts of the plants are toxic if eaten, and the leaves can irritate sensitive skin. This also makes them deer and rabbit resistant. To get a jump start on the 2-year cycle, sow foxglove seeds in late summer, and they should then bloom for you the following spring. You can deadhead them after flowering or discard the whole plant. If you want to collect seeds or let it reseed itself in your garden, then allow a few spent flower stalks to remain until the seeds disperse. Foxglove, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, the snow and ice are finally melting. I still haven't seen any sign of my winter jasmine blooming or my snowdrops. It's probably the latest I've ever had to wait for those blooms. Our January 2025 issue of Washington Gardener has been posted. Our cover story is on straw flowers. We have lots of great content inside. Check out that issue at washingtongardener.blogspot.com. And the last Saturday of January is National Seed Swap Day. We are hosting 2 seed exchanges, one on Saturday, January 25th, Seed Swap Day itself at Brookside Gardens, and the following Saturday, February 1st, at Green Spring Gardens in Alexandria, Virginia. You can find out more and register for them at seedswapday.com or seedswapday.blogspot.com. And some local gardening events you might be interested in, including the PATH Forum, that's PAPH, like Pathiopedilum Forum, being put on by the National Capital Orchid Society on Saturday, February 8th. You can find out more about that at the NCOS website. And at Green Spring Gardens, they are hosting a winter lecture on Sunday, February 9th at 1:30 p.m., Gardens in the Age of Jumping Worms. Researcher Jordan Thompson will dive into the impacts of the invasive Asian jumping worms on soil health and garden ecosystems. Learn all about the unique challenges these worms pose to soil structure, nutrient cycling, and plant growth, and get practical advice and steps on how to deal with them. That's $15 per person. You can register online for that workshop at fairfaxcounty.gov under their Parks tab. Happy gardening.
This is the last word from Christy Page with Food Gardening Network on 10 tips for starting seeds in egg cartons. Egg cartons, like popsicle sticks and pipe cleaners, are one of the quintessential craft items for school projects. You can turn an egg carton into a bird feeding tray or a spaceship. It's perfect for holding odds and ends in your cupboard, and it's perfect for gardening. But starting seeds in egg cartons isn't just a fun biology experiment. There are a lot of good reasons to get your garden started this way. For one thing, you can get a dozen starter cups free when you buy your eggs. Free is good. Plus, egg cartons are biodegradable, so you can place your egg carton seedlings directly into the soil when the time comes. Now, here are 10 easy steps for starting seeds in egg cartons. Number 1, select the right egg carton. You do not want styrofoam or plastic. Paper-based egg cartons are the way to go. Number 2, select the right sized egg carton. Do you want 6, 12, 18? Get the size that matches the number of plants you want to grow. Number 3, separate each egg cup. Not immediately essential, but you're going to have to do it eventually. Number 4, poke holes in the bottom of the egg cups. Number 5, add fresh soil. Number 6, add your seeds. Number 7, cover with soil. Number 8, place your egg cups, now the seed cups, on a tray or plate. When you water them, the water will drain. Number 9, water your seeds. You'll most likely need to water them every day, but don't overdo it. Number 10, place them in a sunny spot. Find a nice sunny area for your seeds to live. It's really fun to watch them every day as they start to grow. Now, when the time comes, you can plant your seeds directly into the garden. The egg carton material will decompose, so you can feel comfortable putting it in the ground. And until that happens, the roots of the plant should have no trouble breaking through the material, so you don't need to worry about that either. This has been The Last Word by Christy Page at foodgardening.com.
Thank you for listening to Garden DC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to the supporter link in our show notes or directly to podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com or WashingtonGardener.blogspot.com. You can find Washington Gardener on social media at WDC Gardener on Twitter or X, Instagram, and Pinterest, and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. And be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Please take a minute to share us on social media with #GardenDC so other gardeners can find us too.